does not describe the institution of the sovereign in terms of a monarchy rather than a republic in the modern sense. The text insists on the function of the sovereign and the necessity for the sovereign to become embodied. Now, of course, the famous frontispiece of the Leviathan, which we all have in mind, gives a monarchic and also a mystical twist to that. It's the famous page where you have the monster, the Leviathan, represented as a giant whose body is made of many different persons. They are turned. In the first version, there are fascinating studies on that. First version of the drawing, which Prof carefully designed with the help of a great thinker of the time, a great artist of the time, they were turned towards the reader, whereas in the final version they are always a very strange paradoxical representation, what a German scholar has called the visual strategies of art. A little man who form this giant taken together are turning their face towards their own head, which is the head of the sovereign here, and then he is holding on one side a sword, and on the other side a bishop's cross, which in first version was the sword and the balance of justice. This is what results of a very fascinating system of allegories. And then there's the bottom where the two powers joined in the person of the sovereign are illustrated by different allegoric implications. And in the middle you have a landscape, remember that, with absolutely nobody. This is very strange, an empty landscape with cities, rivers, even sea in the corner, on which the sovereign, whose body is the people and whose head is the incarnation of the sovereign function in the form of a monarch, is dominating. But it's not impossible that Hobbes had imagined that this could be also, in a sense, appropriated by the Republican regime of Oliver Cromwell. Another indication is that the main function that is attributed to the sovereign in the text is to protect the people, and Cromwell as head or chief of the English Commonwealth had received or had taken for himself the name of Lord Protector. This should, of course, not be things that the contemporaries would leave unnoticed. So it's okay. So here is the passage from chapter 17. The only way to erect such a common power as may be able to, this is slightly old-fashioned English, but which I find very nice. I hope you won't find it difficult to understand. The only way to erect such a common power as may be able to, which is capital, to defend them from the invasion of foreigners and the injuries of one another, and thereby to secure them in such sort as that by their own industry and by the fruits of the earth they may nourish themselves and live contentedly, is, very long phrase, to confer all their power and strength upon one man, with a capital, or upon one assembly of men, that may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices unto one will. Listen to that, because we'll find almost exactly the same words in Rousseau, with some nuances. Which is as much as to say, to appoint one man or assembly of men to bear their person, with a capital P, and everyone to own and acknowledge himself to be the other. This is not to own in the sense of possess. It's to own as the opposite of disown, I mean to acknowledge, to recognize. To own and acknowledge himself to be the other of whatsoever he that so beareth their person shall act. I repeat, to bear, and everyone to own, that is to confess, to admit, and acknowledge himself to be the other of whatsoever he that so beareth their person shall act. Meaning the sovereign does something, and the subject admits that this is done by them, by themselves, that they are the authors of the action. So the distinction here is between the author and the actor. The sovereign will be acting, and the subject or the citizen will be authoring, so to speak, or recognize themselves as authors of what is done not by themselves but by somebody else in their name. Or cause to be acted, or excuse me, so whatsoever he that so beareth their person shall act, or cause to be acted, in those things which concern the common peace and safety. That is, not in private matters, but in matters that conform to the republic as such. And therein to submit their wills, everyone to his will, and their judgments to his judgment. This is more than consent or concord. It is a real unity of them all, in one and the same person, made by covenant of every man with every man, in such manner as if every man should say to every man. Now listen to this. This is also very interesting from the literary point of view, which is crucial for the philosophical interpretation as such, because you will find the exact repetition of that in Rousseau with a different content. So a voice is introduced in the text, a fictitious voice, which is the voice of the subjects would be citizens, that will become citizens by the performative effect of that enunciation, speaking unanimously. And then the text gives them the voice, and it's printed in italic. I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man, or to this assembly of men, on this condition that thou, so you, I mean second person, classical language, thou, that is any other, they speak to one another, thou give up thy right to him, and authorize all his actions in like manner. This is of course the condition for this declaration to be valid, or for the performative effect to take place. So each one is speaking fictitiously to each other, and says, I abandon my rights, and thereby I become the author of to the sovereign, and I become the author of his actions, on the condition that you do the same. And of course, if you don't do the same, the pact is, or the covenant is broken and invalid. This done, the multitude so united in one person is called a commonwealth. In Latin, civitas, a community of citizens, or a city. This is the generation of that great Leviathan, or rather, there is strange parenthesis, to speak more reverently. I'm not sure this is reverence, because this is blasphemic, in fact, in many respects, of that mortal God, to which we owe under the immortal God our peace and defense. For by this authority given him by every particular man in the commonwealth, he has the use of so much power and strength conferred on him, that by terror thereof he is enabled to form the wills of them all, to peace at home, etc., etc. Just one phrase, and he that carries this person is called sovereign, and said to have sovereign power, and everyone besides his subject. Now, immediately jump to Rousseau's text in the social contract. It's chapter 6 of part 1. So I'm using a translation that I bought this morning. Purposely, I only had the French text, but I had this passage in French. I give you one or two French expressions that are important, but I also needed something in the continuation which I didn't have. So let's read it in English, although it's written initially in French. Properly understood, this is chapter 6 of the part 1 of Rousseau's social contract. Properly understood, the clauses of the contract or the covenant that creates the city, or, and as he said very remarkably in the previous chapter, makes a people, and not just that is a real unity, or in his terminology, an association, as opposed to mere aggregates. These are the words that he uses. Properly understood, the clauses can all be reduced to one alone, namely the complete transfer of each associate with all his rights to the whole community. For, in the first place, each giving himself completely, the condition is the same for all, and the condition being the same for all, none has any interest in making it burdensome to the other. That's okay. Further, the transfer being carried out unreservedly, the union between the associates is as perfect as it can be, and none of them has any further requirements to add. For if individuals retain some rights, there being no common superior to give judgment between them and the public, each would make his own judgment on certain points, and would soon aspire to do so on all of them. The state of nature would remain in force, and the association would become necessarily either tyrannical or meaningless. I cannot comment everything, but of course this very clearly expresses the idea that the abandonment of the rights, including, as we will see in the following section, the right of property, or better said, the right of possessing goods and land, and estates, etc., must be complete. The abandonment must be complete. Of course, Rousseau's idea, which will be explained in the following section, is that what the individuals have abandoned to the community, or in that sense, don't use the term state, because you see he uses it for a different purpose. They will receive back. But they will receive back in a different form, which is not natural, if you like, or which is legal, or which is authorized precisely by the community. But of course, that will also involve the idea that the community, at least ideally, being, so to speak, the necessary intermediary between each individual and his or her legal property, retains, of course, the capacity. That's very much an aspect of the notion of public interest in the Republican, of course, socialist position, will retain the capacity to decide that there are cases in which the individual right must become limited in the interest, of course, of the community itself. So, let's return to the text. Finally, each in giving himself to all gives himself to none. Formula that has carried extraordinary consequences. Enfin, chacun se donnant à tous, il se donne à personne. And since there are no associates over whom he does not acquire the same rights as he sees, he gains the equivalent of all that he loses, and greater strength for the conservation of